I knew the second I stepped onto my porch that the world had tilted off its axis, because there was my son, a man who had survived 3 deployments as a Navy SEAL and seen things that would make most people's skin crawl, standing deathly still in our own driveway, while some suburban wannabe hero pointed a loaded pistol right at his forehead. It wasn't an oppos, one of those movie standoffs where people are shouting and trading insults. No, it was quiet, terrifyingly quiet, with the late afternoon sun glinting off the barrel of that gun, and my son just staring into the man's eyes like he was looking at a minor inconvenience rather than his own death. This guy, this in quote, security officer in quote, named Silas Thorne, who'd been hired by our local homeowners association, was shaking so hard his tactical vest was rattling, his face a messy cocktail of pure ego and blind panic as he barked about in quote, community compliance in quote, and in quote, unauthorized personnel in quote, and I just stood there frozen on the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My son, Jackson, didn't an oppos. Blink didn't an oppos. Shift his weight. He just let out this low, steady breath and said, in quote, "You're making a choice right now that you can't take back, Silas, so you'd better be damn sure you want to die for a parking violation," end quote. And honestly, looking back at how we got to that moment, I realized it wasn't an oppos. Just about a motorcycle or a lawn. It was about what happens when you give a small person a tiny bit of power and let them think they're a god. It all started about 2 weeks before Jackson came home on leave, when the neighborhood's vibe shifted from, in quote, quiet suburbia, in quote, to, in quote, occupied territory, in quote. Thanks to our new HOA president, a woman named Beatrice Vane, who treated our cul-de-sac like her own private fiefdom. Beatrice was the kind of person who lived for the thrill of a citation, a woman who probably spent her nights reading property bylaws by candlelight and dreaming of measuring people's grass with a ruler, and she decided we needed, in quote, professional enforcement, in quote, to keep the property values up. Enter Silas Thorne, a guy who looked like he'd been rejected from every police academy in the state and decided to compensate by buying the most expensive tactical gear he could find on the internet, strutting around our streets in a black vest that said, in quote, security, in quote, in giant letters, looking for any excuse to play soldier. I'd already had my run-ins with him. He'd given me a formal warning because my mailbox was, in quote, slightly off-center, in quote, and a citation because I dared to park my work truck on the street for 2 hours while I unloaded groceries. But I just rolled my eyes and paid the fines because life is too short to argue with a man who carries a clipboard like a weapon. Then Jackson came home, looking lean and exhausted, carrying the weight of 9 months in the desert on his shoulders, wanting nothing more than a quiet place to sleep and a decent cup of coffee. And that's when the real friction started. Silas didn't an oppos. Like Jackson from the jump, mostly because Jackson had this quiet, unbreakable confidence that made Silas feel small, and especially because Jackson's vintage Harley was, in quote, too loud, in quote, and in quote, visually disruptive, in quote, according to the new community standards Beatrice had cooked up. The first time Silas tried to write a ticket, Jackson just looked at him with those cold, steady eyes and told him to talk to me, which Silas took as a personal insult to his authority, and from that moment on, it was personal. Silas started, in quote, patrolling, in quote, our house every hour, shining his flashlight into our windows at night, checking the height of our hedges, just waiting for a crack in the armor, and I told Jackson to just ignore it, to let the little man have his power trip. But you can only push a man who's been trained to neutralize threats so far before he starts pushing back. The day everything went sideways, Silas had decided to perform an, in quote, unannounced perimeter inspection, in quote, of our backyard, literally unlatching our gate and walking into our private space while we were having a quiet lunch on the patio. Jackson stood up, not aggressive, just solid, and told him very clearly to step back outside the gate. But Silas, fueled by Beatrice's constant emails about, in quote, asserting dominance over non-compliant residents, in quote, decided this was his moment to be tough. He started screaming about, in quote, obstruction of HOA duties, in quote, and, in quote, interference with a security official, in quote, his voice cracking and going up an octave as he realized Jackson wasn't an oppos, backing down, and that's when his ego finally outpaced his common sense. He followed Jackson out to the driveway, still ranting, getting closer and closer until he was spitting when he talked, and when Jackson finally turned around, and told him to go home before he embarrassed himself. Silas reached under that heavy black vest and pulled out a Glock. I remember thinking, this ISN and Oppos, T happening, this is a neighborhood with a communal pool and a bake sale, people donning Oppos. T pull guns over property lines, but the metal was real and the finger on the trigger was trembling. My stomach turned to ice as I watched my son look down the barrel of that gun. But Jackson's expression never changed. He just tilted his head slightly like he was studying a confusing bug and said, and quote, "Silas, your safety is off, your grip is sloppy, and you're shaking so hard you're likely to hit the neighbor's house instead of me." End quote. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. The sheer clinical coldness of a man who understood violence in a way Silas never could. And I could see Silas's brain just stalling out, his face turning a sickly shade of white as he realized he'd started a game he didn't and Oppos to know how to finish. He kept barking at Jackson to get on his knees, to, end quote, submit to community detention, end quote, but Jackson just stood there, hands at his sides, radiating a kind of calm that was more intimidating than any scream could ever be, and he whispered, end quote, "I'm going to give you 10 seconds to holster that weapon and walk away. And if you don an Oppos, the world is going to get very small and very painful for you," end quote. Just then, Silas's eyes flickered to the little blue ring of light on our doorbell camera, and you could see the exact moment the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He wasn't an Oppos, just end quote, enforcing the code, end quote, anymore. He was committing a felony in 4K resolution. He started stammering, saying it was end quote, authorized offensive display, end quote. But the panic was total now, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he backed up, the gun waving wildly in the air. I tried to step down to intervene, to maybe talk him down, but Jackson's hand went up just a fraction of an inch, and he told me to stay back, his voice like grinding stone, never taking his eyes off Silas for even a millisecond. Silas, feeling the walls closing in, did the most desperate, cowardly thing a person can do when they're outmatched. He didn't end Oppos. He lunged at the man who was a threat. He lunged at me, the old man on the porch, thinking if he could get a hand on my collar, he could use me as leverage to get out of the driveway. He didn't end Oppos to even get close. Jackson moved with a speed that I couldn't end Oppos to even process, a blur of denim and muscle, and before Silas could even let out a breath, Jackson had closed the gap, twisted Silas's wrist in a way that sounded like dry sticks snapping, and the gun was suddenly in Jackson's hand, pointed at the ground. Silas fell back into the gravel, clutching his arm, howling like a wounded animal, but his pride was still fighting his survival instinct, and he scrambled toward his waistband, reaching for a backup knife or maybe just acting on pure, mindless adrenaline. Jackson didn't end Oppos. T hesitate. He didn't end Oppos. T wait for Silas to find whatever he was looking for. He just barked, end quote, "Move, Dad," end quote. And as I dived to the side, a single shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the quiet afternoon air. Silas collapsed instantly, clutching his leg where the bullet had torn through his thigh, the gravel turning dark red as he wailed about being, end quote, murdered, end quote, while Jackson stood over him, the gun held in a perfect, professional, low-ready position. The aftermath was a whirlwind of sirens and flashing lights. And when the county sheriff, a man named Miller who'd known me for 20 years, rolled up and saw Jackson holding a gun over a bleeding Silas, I thought for a second we were all going to prison. But Miller looked at the gun, then he looked at the, end quote, security, end quote, vest on the ground, then he looked at the ring camera, and he just sighed and shook his head, telling the medics to patch Silas up but to keep the handcuffs ready. Within an hour, they had the footage, and it was all there, the trespassing, the brandishing, the attempted kidnapping when Silas lunged for me, and the clear-cut case of Jackson defending his father from an armed, unstable assailant. It turns out Silas had been fired from 3 different security firms for, end quote, unstable behavior, end quote, and shooting in Oppos. T had been carrying a toothpick, let alone a firearm, and Beatrice Vane had known all of it, but hired him anyway because he promised to, end quote, get results, end quote, where other guards were too soft. The legal hammer fell hard, and it fell fast, because you can't Oppos. T just hire a private militia to terrorize a neighborhood and expect the law to look the other way when things get bloody. Silas Thorne was hit with a laundry list of felonies: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, impersonating a peace officer, and attempted kidnapping. And because he'd done it all on camera, his lawyer couldn't into oppose. T do much but plead for mercy, which the judge wasn't oppose. T interested in giving, sentencing him to a solid 12 years in the state pen. Beatrice Vane didn't and oppose. T fare much better. She was dragged out of her house in zip ties after an audit found she'd been skimming HOA funds to pay Silas's, and quote, special consulting fees, and quote, under the table, and she ended up losing her house, her reputation, and her freedom for 5 years on conspiracy and embezzlement charges. The neighborhood is quiet now, truly quiet, the kind of quiet where you can actually sit on your porch and drink a beer without someone checking your mailbox height. And Jackson's back on deployment now, probably halfway across the world, but people still talk about the day the, end quote, HOA cop, and quote, try to take on a SEAL. I think about it every time I walk down those porch steps, about how close we came to a tragedy, because one woman wanted to feel important and one man wanted to feel powerful. And it makes me wonder how many other, end quote, Silas Thornes, end quote, are out there right now, hiding behind a badge or a clipboard, just waiting for the wrong person to push back. We like to think our communities are safe, that the rules are there to protect us, but sometimes the rules are just a weapon in the hands of the people who should never be allowed to hold one. It's been a year since that shot rang out of my driveway, and I still get people asking me if I feel bad for Silas, if I think my son went too far by putting a round in his leg. But then I remember the feeling of that cold steel pointed at my son's head and the look in Silas's eyes when he tried to grab me. And I realized that some people only learn where the line is when they're forced to bleed for crossing it. So I'm curious, if you were standing on that porch, watching a man point a gun at your kid over a property dispute, would you wait for the, end quote, proper authorities, end quote, to arrive, or would you want someone like Jackson standing between you and the bullet? What do you think? Is there ever a point where HOA authority goes so far it becomes a criminal enterprise? Or was Silas just a lone wolf who took a bad job way too seriously? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it, because I have a feeling my neighborhood ISN and oppos. T the only one with a tyrant in the front office.